"What the hell are you doing to my son?" He stood frozen in the doorway, his face filled with astonishment, his eyes glued to the scene before him. Maria Wilson, the household maid, was gently cradling Archer's infant son, nursing him. Her blouse was open just enough for Brian to latch on, his tiny body relaxed in her arms. She closed her eyes, humming a lullaby, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Archer froze, his eyes widening before flaring with fury. "Get your hands off my son!" he roared, storming into the room. Maria's eyes widened in shock, her body tensing as instinct took over. She gently, carefully detached Brian from her breast and began to soothe him. "Mr. Morgan, please let me explain," she said, her voice trembling, but he wasn't listening. "You think you can just touch my son? Feed him like some damn wet nurse?" Archer shouted, his voice breaking with rage and disbelief. "This is my son. Who the hell gave you the right?" Maria slowly stood, still holding Brian's small form in her arms. "I didn't plan on this. He hasn't eaten in days." Before we continue following the dramatic developments ahead, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to give me motivation to keep bringing you more captivating stories. And where are you listening to this story from? Leave a comment and let me know. Now, let's return to the story. Imagine you're a man who's built an empire. Everything you have, every decision you've made has been calculated, weighed, and measured. You own businesses that span continents, and your name commands respect. You've created a world for yourself where power, wealth, and control sit like rulers. At a banquet table, you have the life that people dream about, or so it seems. But no matter how much you achieve, how many accolades you collect, something in you remains tethered to a past that you can't shake. Something unseen, untold, like a shadow that follows you through the house. And one day, that shadow takes form. Archer Morgan walked through the hallway of his grand home in the same way he had done for years. The marble floors gleamed beneath his polished shoes, the golden accents of the fixtures catching the light. His steps echoed down the vast hall, a sound that had become part of the house, a sound that no one noticed anymore, not even him. His mind was preoccupied with a meeting he had just come from, the company, the board, the future. It all swirled in his head, but as he neared the nursery, something made him stop. He wasn't sure why he felt it, but he did. It was the kind of instinct that lived deep inside a man, one that he rarely acknowledged. The kind of feeling that told him something wasn't right. Inside, the nursery door was cracked open. The room was bathed in soft light, the faint hum of a lullaby playing from the speakers overhead. He peered inside, and there it was. Maria Wilson, the woman who'd come to care for his child, was sitting in the chair by the crib. Her blouse, slightly askew, revealed a sight that turned his stomach, though not for the reasons he might have expected. She was nursing his infant son, Brian. And in that moment, Archer saw only a blur of anger, confusion, and something deeper, something darker. He froze. For a moment, the entire world stopped. Her eyes closed as she hummed gently, the same softness he had seen before. The same woman who had always been so calm, so collected. But now, in the quiet of that room, in the delicate warmth of the connection between her and his son, there was something more. Something that he could not place. Brian, his child, held to her breast, so trusting, so unaware. Archer's heart clenched, but the fury began to well up inside him like a storm building on the horizon. How could she, how could anyone think that this was acceptable? It wasn't supposed to be like this. Maria had come into their lives as an outsider, hired to care for his son, to tend to the child that his wife had left behind. But now Archer's mind raced with 1,000 questions, none of which made sense. He stepped forward, his shoes striking the floor with a force that broke the silence. "What the hell are you doing to my son?" The words came out harsh, jagged. Maria looked up, her eyes wide, startled. She slowly detached Brian from her breast, the baby now cradled in her arms, his tiny face scrunching as he whimpered, uncomprehending. "Mr. Morgan, please," Maria's voice trembled, though she held herself steady. "Please let me explain." But Archer wasn't listening. He took a step closer, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the anger inside him. "Oh, you think you can just touch my child? Feed him like some damn wet nurse?" His voice cracked, a mix of rage and disbelief. "This is my son. Who the hell gave you the right?" Maria stood slowly, the baby still nestled in her arms. "I didn't plan it," she said, her voice quieter now, as if trying to calm the storm. "He hadn't eaten in days. The formula he kept rejecting. He was growing weaker, and I used to be a neonatal nurse. I still produce milk. He latched. He needed it." Archer's fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling. "Shut up," he barked. His hand flew up without thought, striking her face with a sharp, open-handed slap that sent her stumbling backward. The sound of it rang in the room, loud, final. Brian let out a sharp cry, and Maria, still holding the baby, caught herself, steadying her balance. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just stared at Archer, stunned. Slowly she turned, her body a shield for the child in her arms. "How dare you?" she whispered. Archer's breath came in short bursts, his chest rising and falling as he stared at her. He couldn't take back what he had done, he couldn't even understand it. But as he looked at her, something else began to creep into his mind. A deep, unsettling thought bredenned. What had she really done wrong? "I saved your son," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the words cut through him. Archer's heart stilled, his mind reeled, but he couldn't speak. His hands trembled at his sides, still clenched, but unsure what to do next. "I saved him," Maria repeated, her eyes holding his, daring him to look away. Archer turned away, the anger inside him now like a fire that burned too fast, too bright. "I don't need saving from someone like you," he spat, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. She stood still, staring at his back, her expression unreadable. But then she said something that stopped him in his tracks. "Someone like me?" Her voice was sharp now, cutting through the tension. "You mean black, poor, a woman?" Archer flinched, but he didn't answer. Maria's words seemed to echo in the room, lingering like smoke in the air. She took a breath, her eyes narrowing as she gathered her strength. "I lost a baby 3 months ago," she said, her voice breaking just slightly, but she held it together. "I held him in my arms as he died. I know what it feels like to be helpless, to watch someone so small slip away while you stand there doing nothing." Her eyes softened then, a touch of empathy in the quiet pain that lingered between them. "I saw that same look in Brian yesterday, and I did what a mother does. I acted." Archer's eyes closed for a moment, his breath unsteady, his fists still clenched. Without another word, Maria placed Brian gently in his crib, her movements slow and deliberate. The baby shifted slightly, then stilled, his tiny body finally at rest. "I'll get my things," Maria said softly, her voice resolute. Archer didn't stop her. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. His hands still trembled at his side, but he remained frozen in the doorway as she walked past him. Disappearing down the hall, Maria's footsteps echoed through the halls, each step a quiet reminder of the brokenness she had just witnessed. The air in the house felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something no one could stop. She didn't dare look back, though the image of Archer, standing there, fists clenched, remained etched in her mind. He had been so sure, so certain of his anger, his righteousness. But she knew deep down that he would carry this weight with him long after she was gone. She didn't know why she stayed so long in the first place. Maybe because, despite everything, the boy needed her. Maybe because the small moments, the quiet acts of care, were the only thing that had kept her grounded in a world that had so often crushed her. But now, as she made her way to the servants' quarters to gather her things, she felt the deep sting of her decision. Was it worth it, all of it, the cost of her dignity, her safety, her peace? But then she thought of Brian, his small hands, his trusting eyes. He needed her. In a way, she had needed him too. Perhaps it was selfish, but she had learned that the most honest moments in life come when you stop pretending, when you let the rawness of it all spill out like ink on a page. She had seen herself in that child, seen the same vulnerability, the same need. And maybe, just maybe, that's why she couldn't walk away. But now she was. The sound of a knock at her door made her pause, her heart skipping a beat. She didn't expect anyone to follow her, certainly not so soon after everything had unfolded. She opened the door slowly, half expecting to see Archer, angry and determined to throw her out with one last blast of fury. But it wasn't him, it was Ella Morgan. The older woman stood in the doorway, her silver-gray hair twisted in a tight knot, her expression unreadable. In her hand she held a tray of tea. It seemed out of place, absurd even. The image of a grandmother offering tea to a woman she had just been slapped by seemed almost ridiculous. And yet there it was. "May I come in?" Ella asked, her voice calm, unshaken by the storm that had just erupted. Maria nodded, stepping aside to allow her entry. She didn't know what to expect. Part of her expected Ella to be like the rest of them, to chastise her, to tell her she had overstepped her bounds. But there was something different about Ella, something that made her stand apart from the rest. She wasn't just another member of the Morgan family, standing on the side of tradition, of power. She was someone who had seen the cost of it all. Someone who had, perhaps, learned that the truth was not always something you could bury beneath layers of silence. The older woman sat in the chair opposite Maria and set the tea tray down carefully on the table. Maria watched her, still unsure of what was coming next. "I was told what happened," Ella began, her voice steady, as though the chaos that had just unfolded had never touched her. Maria didn't answer immediately. She was still reeling from the slap, from the way Archer had looked at her. That was what had hurt the most, after all. The look in his eyes, the disbelief, the hatred. The slap had been nothing compared to the way he had looked at her, like she was nothing, less than human, as though she had no right to be there. She swallowed hard before speaking. "He's angry. He doesn't understand." Ella nodded, as though she understood exactly what Maria meant. "Archer's grieving," she said quietly. "Ah, but that doesn't excuse what he did." Maria's lips parted as if she were about to say something, but she stopped herself. What was there to say? What could she possibly say to someone who had witnessed the ugly side of the Morgan family? Someone who had lived in this house long enough to understand how things worked? "I know," Maria whispered. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The silence between them seemed to stretch like a thin thread, fragile and worn. "You could press charges," Ella said after a while. Her voice was softer now, almost comforting, as though she was offering a possibility rather than a suggestion. "You could make him pay for what he did." Maria shook her head slowly. "No, I don't want to do that." Ella regarded her for a moment, studying her face, as though weighing the truth of her words. "You're stronger than most," she said finally. "I can see it in you. Most would have fought back." "But you didn't." "I don't want to fight anymore," Maria replied quietly. "I just want to do right by him." "By Brian," Ella sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I lost a child too, a long time ago." She paused, her eyes distant as she spoke, like she was reliving a memory that had stayed with her for decades. "I understand the need to protect them, to keep them safe. But sometimes doing what's right means taking the harder path." Maria swallowed hard, unsure of where the conversation was heading. Ella continued, "Archer doesn't see it yet. He's too wrapped up in his grief, too focused on trying to fix things that aren't his to fix. But you didn't wait for him to act. You saw a child in need, and you did what a mother would do." Maria felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't thought of it like that, hadn't realized how deeply the weight of her actions would resonate with someone else. But it made sense, and for the first time Maria felt as though someone truly understood. "Are you planning to leave?" Ella asked, her voice cutting through the silence that had grown between them. Maria shook her head. "I thought I should," she admitted. "After everything that happened, it's clear I don't belong here." Ella's eyes softened, and she stood moving to the door. She paused with her hand on the knob, turning back to face Maria. "You saved my grandson," she said simply, her voice low but firm. "You didn't cross a line. You stepped in where we failed." Maria stood, her heart heavy but resolute. "I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because he needed me." Ella smiled faintly. "If you leave, it should be your choice, not because of a man who lashed out in pain." With that, Ella left, her footsteps soft against the floor, leaving Maria standing in the room, her thoughts swirling. The air felt different after Ella left, quieter somehow, as if the room had settled into its own rhythm, a slower beat that Maria couldn't quite catch. She had expected to feel relief after the conversation, perhaps even the freedom to walk away. But instead, a sense of heaviness clung to her, crowed as though the walls themselves were asking her to stay, asking her to be part of something more than the role she had been given. She looked around the room, as if expecting something, some sign, some answer, but nothing came. Her bag sat by the door, half packed, the clothes inside her suitcase neatly folded but untouched. She had almost convinced herself that leaving was the right choice. But now, in the stillness of the room, with the weight of everything that had happened pressing on her chest, Maria wasn't so sure anymore. She thought of Brian, of his tiny body nestled in her arms as he drifted off to sleep, his soft breaths the only sound in the room. He needed her. He was still so small, so fragile, and yet he had a quiet strength in him. She had seen it in the way he looked at her, the way his tiny hands gripped her finger when he was upset. He knew her, trusted her in a way that no one else did. She couldn't walk away from that. Not yet. Her mind drifted back to the conversation with Ella. The older woman had understood, had seen perhaps the same depth of emotion in Maria that she had seen in herself so long ago. Ella's words had given her something, a seed of doubt, a reason to stay. But what was it really? What was it she was holding on to? The sound of footsteps in the hallway broke her thoughts, and she turned, half expecting Archer to appear, to shout at her, to force her to leave. But it wasn't him, it was Brian's nanny, Gloria, with her tight smile and judgmental eyes. She stood in the doorway, holding a tea tray in her hands, her posture stiff and proper. "You're still here?" Gloria asked, her voice thick with disdain, though she kept it well hidden behind her polite smile. Maria stood taller, her shoulders straightening, the weight of the conversation with Ella still heavy in her chest, but giving her strength. She wasn't going to let Gloria's words, her insinuations, pierce her the way they once had. The way they once had. She wasn't going to shrink away anymore. "I'm still here," Maria replied, her voice steady. Gloria's smile faltered just slightly, but she recovered quickly. "It's a shame, really." "You're not meant to be here," she said, setting the tray down on the table with a sharp clink. "People like you never are." Maria felt the sting of Gloria's words, but she refused to let them show. "And what people would that be, Gloria?" she asked, her voice cold but controlled. Gloria's eyes narrowed. "People like you who don't know their place, who think they can cross boundaries, step into worlds they don't belong in. You're just a maid, a servant. Nothing more." Maria's heart beat louder in her chest now, the old wounds opening up. She knew what Gloria was implying, the same thing everyone in this house had thought of her from the beginning. She was nothing more than the help, a woman from the outside meant to serve, and nothing else. She had tried to ignore it, to push it down, to make herself forget that it was always there, hovering just beneath the surface. But now, in the face of Gloria's words, it all came rushing back. A flood of memories and insults that she had never allowed herself to face. But something inside her shifted. She stood taller, her jaw set, and she walked toward Gloria. Her steps deliberate, unhurried. "You're wrong," she said softly, her voice firm. "I'm not just a maid. I'm a mother. And that's something you'll never understand." Gloria flinched, the words hitting her harder than Maria had expected. For a moment she stood frozen, caught off guard by the quiet strength in Maria's voice. But she quickly recovered, her sneer returning. "You think that's enough?" Gloria asked, her tone dripping with mockery. "You think because you play mother to a child that isn't yours, you're somehow better than the rest of us?" Maria's eyes hardened. Laber to fore. She could feel the anger rising in her chest. Rio, but she refused to let it take over. She couldn't afford to let Gloria have that kind of power over her anymore. "I don't need to be better than you," Maria said, her voice steady but resolute. "I just need to be good enough for him, for Brian." Gloria laughed, but it was bitter. "You think you've earned a place in this family, in his life? You're nothing. You're just a woman who showed up when things got hard." Maria felt her blood boil, but she pressed on, her words quiet but sharp. "I'm not here for their approval. I'm here because I'm needed." Gloria's gaze flickered for just a moment, her mask slipping, but she quickly regained her composure. "You'll see. It won't last. They'll get tired of you, just like they do with everyone." But Maria didn't respond. She didn't need to. The words were hollow, the threat meaningless. Gloria was scared, Maria realized. She was scared because Maria had done what no one else had done. She had stepped into a world that wasn't meant for her and made it hers. Gloria left the room without another word, her footsteps quick, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Maria stood there for a moment, her heart still racing, but now with something else. It wasn't fear or anger. It was something else entirely. She wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. Not while Brian needed her. Not while the truth still lingered in the air, waiting to be set free. The house fell silent once more. But this time it wasn't the same silence. It wasn't the silence of oppression, of secrets and lies buried beneath years of tradition. No, this was the silence of something new. Something that had been born in the wake of everything that had happened. And in that silence, Maria found her peace. The morning passed like any other cow, but it felt different. The house was still a maze of polished marble and high ceilings, but it no longer held the same weight. Archer had been distant since the night he'd stormed out of the nursery. He'd retreated into the office, the one place that still seemed to offer him some semblance of control. But Maria knew better than to expect him to come to her. He had done his damage, and now he would either face the consequences or continue to bury the truth deeper inside himself. She couldn't make that decision for him. Maria spent the morning tending to Brian. The baby had fallen into a peaceful rhythm since the night in the nursery. His appetite stronger, his cries fewer. Every morning she would walk into the nursery and see his small, trusting face, his hands reaching out to her with a kind of certainty that made her heart ache. He had become a reason to fight, a reason to stay. His presence was a comfort in a house that seemed to have forgotten what comfort was. As she sat with him in the rocking chair, gently feeding him his bottle root, Maria's mind wandered again to the conversation with Ella. The older woman had spoken about grief and the way it twisted people, distorting their vision of what was right and what was just. She had been right, in a way. Archer's grief had led him to lash out, to hurt the very person who had, in a sense, saved his child. Maria could understand it in the deepest parts of herself, but understanding didn't mean forgiveness. And yet she had stayed. She wasn't sure if it was out of a sense of duty or something more primal, the need to fix what had been broken. She didn't know, but what she did know was this Brendel, she would never leave Brian, not now. Not until he didn't need her anymore, and even then she wasn't sure if she could walk away. Later that afternoon, as she walked down the corridor, her eyes caught sight of the family portrait on the wall. It was an old one, showing Archer, his late wife Clara, and their son, Eric. The portrait was framed in a heavy gold frame, its edges worn from years of hanging. It was a picture of a family before everything fell apart, before the secrets started to unravel. Maria paused before the picture, her eyes tracing the faces frozen in time. She wondered what Archer's life had been like before the weight of his father's legacy had crushed him, before his wife's tragic death had left him a shell of the man he once was. He had been someone else then, someone capable of love, capable of understanding. But now, looking at the picture, Maria couldn't help but feel pity for the man he had become. He had everything, wealth, power, influence, but he was empty. His grief, his anger, it had hollowed him out. And in the process, it had poisoned everything he touched. Mr. Morgan. Maria turned sharply, her heart racing as she found herself face to face with Gloria again. The woman's eyes were cold, her lips pressed tightly together. She had clearly been looking for an excuse to speak to Maria, and now she had found it. "You still here, huh?" Gloria asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Thought you'd be gone by now, given how things went down." Maria didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The silence between them spoke volumes. Gloria's eyes flickered with some strange mixture of resentment and curiosity. It was clear that she had never liked Maria. But the animosity between them had grown sharper after the events of the previous night. And now Maria could see that Gloria was looking for some kind of confirmation, some sign that she was still in control of her position in this house. Maria took a deep breath, her eyes locking with Gloria's. "I'm still here," she said simply, her voice calm but firm, "and I'm not going anywhere." Gloria's eyes narrowed, but she didn't say anything. The tension in the air between them was thick enough to cut through, yet neither of them moved. Maria could feel the weight of the woman's gaze on her, the way it burned into her skin. But she didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that it was better to stand tall, even when the weight of the world felt like it was crushing you. Gloria let out a small, irritated sigh and turned on her heel, her footsteps echoing down the hall. As she walked away, Maria couldn't help but think that this house, with all its wealth and grandeur, Ku had been built on secrets. But now those secrets were slowly rising to the surface, and no matter how much Gloria or anyone else tried to bury them, the truth would always find a way to be heard. That evening, after dinner, Maria stood alone on the balcony overlooking the estate. The cool night air brushed against her skin, and the distant sound of wind chimes tinkled in the breeze. She looked out over the grounds, the sprawling lawns lit only by the soft glow of garden lights. The house behind her seemed quieter now, more empty. There were no sounds of footsteps, no murmurs of conversation. The only thing that remained was the hum of the world outside, the world that had always been there, untouched by the drama and pain that had unfolded inside these walls. And yet Maria knew that even now she was standing on the edge of something. She was part of something that had been set into motion long before she arrived. Archer, she whispered to herself, the name heavy on her tongue. She didn't know what to expect from him anymore. But she also knew that it was only a matter of time before he came to her again. He couldn't stay away forever. He would need to face what he had done, face the woman he had struck, and perhaps find a way to make it right. Maria didn't know what that would look like. She didn't know if she was strong enough to forgive him, or if she ever would. But what she did know was this party out. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. And for the first time, she didn't feel small in this house. Not anymore. The days that followed passed in a haze, as though the air in the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Archer remained in his study most of the time, his figure a shadow behind the frosted glass windows. Maria kept to her routine, moving quietly through the house with Brian in tow. The house felt less like a home and more like a tomb, each room a museum of memories, untouched and unspoken. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more lurking just beneath the surface. Brian's tiny fingers, now more curious than ever, seemed to reach for something unseen in the air. Maria would catch him staring at the door sometimes, as though waiting for someone to return. Archer had stayed out of sight, but she knew he was still there. Somewhere, trying to make sense of it all. She didn't know if he would ever understand, but she knew that eventually he would have to come to terms with what had happened. The question was, would it be in time? The housemaids whispered as they passed her in the hallway, their eyes quick, their mouths tight. They had all seen what happened. They had all witnessed the violent eruption in the nursery. Maria had never been naive enough to think she was welcomed in this house. But the distance, the judgment, it cut deeper than she expected. It was almost as if she wasn't just an outsider anymore, but a ghost. Something to be avoided, something they were all afraid of. But none of that mattered. What mattered now was Brian. And perhaps, just perhaps, what mattered even more was the fight she had to take on within herself. One evening, after the last of the staff had retreated to their quarters and the house had gone quiet, Maria found herself standing in front of the nursery door, her hand resting on the doorknob. The room beyond it was bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight, the shadows stretching long across the floor. She had been in and out of the room countless times over the past few days. But tonight felt different. She felt the weight of everything, the tension of being caught between two worlds, one where she was just a woman hired to care for a child, and the other where she had become someone's protector. She was more than just a caregiver now. She was the glue holding everything together, even if no one else saw it that way. And that was what made it so complicated. Her hand gripped the doorknob, but before she could turn it, she heard a soft sound from inside the room. She froze. A voice, Archer's voice, broken and low, it sent a ripple of tension through her spine. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly, almost silently, pushed the door open. Archer was standing by the crib, staring down at Brian. Oh, his face pale, his eyes lost. The weight of something heavy, something unspoken, hung in the air. He didn't hear her enter, his mind too consumed by whatever it was that haunted him in that moment. Maria stood quietly in the doorway, watching him for a long while. There was something different about him now. The anger had faded, but it had been replaced by something that seemed even more dangerous. Guilt. He wasn't the same man who had stormed through the nursery, shouting, accusing. This was someone who had come to realize the full extent of his actions, the damage they had caused. This was a man who had been shattered in a way that only grief could shatter a person. But it was more than that. It was the realization that, in one moment, he had made the most awful choice of his life. Maria stood in silence, watching him, not knowing whether to speak or not. She didn't know if she was ready to hear what he had to say. Archer finally turned, his face ashen. For the first time there was nothing in his eyes but vulnerability. He seemed smaller than before, like a man stripped of his armor. "Maria," he began, his voice rough. I don't know what came over me. I didn't." He trailed off, his words faltering as though he couldn't quite bring himself to finish the thought. "You don't need to explain," Maria said softly, stepping into the room, her voice calm but firm. She had already made her peace with it, or at least she was trying to. "You were angry. You were grieving. I understand that. But you can't let it define you." Archer's eyes flickered with something like fear, something like regret. "I don't know how to fix it," he admitted quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't even know where to begin," Maria nodded, her gaze softening. "You don't have to fix everything. Sometimes the only thing you can do is admit that you were wrong and move forward." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air in the room felt thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Archer had finally opened up, but what came next was still unclear. Maria didn't have the answers. She didn't know if she could forgive him, or if she even wanted to. But she also knew that the world didn't stop for any one person. It would keep moving, with or without them. Archer turned back toward Brian, his eyes lingering on the baby, who was still asleep in his crib, oblivious to the tension that had been brewing in the room. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging with the weight of the realization that had hit him. "I've been so focused on the wrong things," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet regret. "I've been so caught up in keeping up appearances, in protecting the legacy, that I forgot what really matters." Maria stepped forward, her heart aching for him, though she didn't let it show. "It's not too late," she said gently. "You can still choose to do better. You can still choose to be there for him." Archer nodded slowly, as if the weight of her words was beginning to settle on him. He turned back to her, his expression sincere. "Thank you for staying, for doing what I couldn't do." Maria's heart tightened. She wanted to say something that would make everything right, something that would fix all the broken pieces. But the truth was, she wasn't sure there was anything she could say. Not yet, but she would try. She would stay as long as Brian needed her, and, for now, that was enough. "Stay," Archer said softly, his voice a plea more than a statement. "I need you. Brian needs you." She looked at him, then at the child in the crib, the boy who had somehow managed to bring them all together. "I'll stay," she said quietly, her heart resolute, for him. And for the first time, Archer seemed to breathe again, quiet as though the burden had lifted from his shoulders, even just a little. Maria turned to leave, but before she did, she looked back at Archer one last time. "There's no going back," she said, her voice steady, her words final, "but there's a way forward, and that's where we start." The days that followed were marked by a tentative peace. It was as if the house had collectively decided to breathe again after holding its breath for so long. The silence that had once felt suffocating began to soften quite, turning into something less oppressive, more manageable. Archer spent more time in the nursery now, sitting by Brian's crib while Maria cared for him. The change was gradual, a slow, steady transformation. There were no grand gestures, no apologies, just quiet moments of understanding. And that was enough for Maria. It was clear, though, that something deeper still lingered in the house, something unspoken that neither she nor Archer had fully acknowledged. The cracks in the facade of their lives ran deep, and it would take more than just time to mend them. But for now, she was willing to let things unfold, to wait and see if Archer could become the man he once was, or at least someone capable of seeing the truth. Maria didn't know when she had started to see herself as part of this place, when it had gone from being just a job, a temporary arrangement, to something more. When had she started thinking of Brian as her own? When had the boundaries between servant and family begun to blur? She had never allowed herself to think about it too much. But now, standing by the crib, watching as Brian's small hands gripped her finger, she realized something. She had a place here. It was small, fragile even, but it was real. The thought settled into her chest like a stone. As the days turned into weeks, Maria found herself spending more time in the quiet spaces of the estate, away from the chaos of the rest of the house. She walked through the gardens, taking in the scent of the roses and the lavender. She would visit the small pond on the edge of the property, where the willow trees bent low to the water's surface. It was a peaceful place, untouched by the world inside the house. It was here, by the pond, that she began to understand the depth of what had happened to Archer. She had seen the pain in his eyes, the grief that still clung to him like a shadow. But it wasn't just that, there was more. Something had happened long before Maria had arrived, something buried deep in the past. Archer had lived a life shaped by his father's expectations, by the weight of the family legacy. It wasn't just the loss of his wife that had broken him, it was everything that had come before. Maria couldn't change that, she couldn't fix the past, but she had the power to change the present. And that was what kept her going, what kept her in the house, day after day. It wasn't for Archer, not entirely, it was for Brian. For the boy who had become a symbol of everything worth fighting for. The house had grown quieter still. The staff moved with more Gloria, more respect. Gloria, who had been so hostile before, now avoided her gaze, her eyes averted whenever Maria passed. It was clear that the power dynamics in the house were shifting, though not without resistance. Maria could feel the undercurrents of tension, the whispers behind closed doors. She knew she would never be fully accepted. But she also knew that she didn't need to be. One afternoon, as she sat in the conservatory, a knock on the door startled her. It was Ella, her figure framed in the doorway. "Maria," Ella said softly, her tone inviting, but firm. "We need to talk." Maria stood, brushing the dust from her lap. She followed Ella down the hall, through the winding corridors, until they reached the library. It was a room that had always seemed off-limits to her, a place where the power of the family had been held in silence, locked away in the form of dusty books and old portraits. But today, as Ella motioned for her to sit, Maria felt no sense of intimidation. She felt calm, steady. "You're staying," Ella said. Once they were seated across from each other, Maria nodded. It wasn't a question. I want you to know that you've done more than just care for Brian. Ella continued, her voice slow, deliberate. You've done something that none of us could do. You've brought life back into this house. It hasn't been easy and it hasn't been pretty, but you've been the glue holding it all together. Maria met Ella's gaze, her eyes steady. I'm just doing what needs to be done. Ella nodded, her expression softening. But you've done it with Gloria, with patience. Something that none of us, especially Archer, have been able to find in ourselves, and for that, I'm grateful. Maria wasn't sure how to respond. She had never expected gratitude from Ella, never expected anything from her but distance. But now she could see the weight in the older woman's eyes. She could see the years of regret, the years of silence that had built up between them. I'm not sure I belong here, Maria said quietly, her voice breaking the stillness. Not in the way you think. I'm not part of this family. I'm just someone doing a job. Ella smiled faintly, as though she had been waiting for this moment. You've done more than a job, Maria. You've been a mother, and sometimes that's all a family needs. Maria blinked, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding on to, how much she had been trying to prove to herself that she didn't need their approval. But in that moment, she understood. She didn't need to be a Morgan. She didn't need to belong in the traditional sense. She had made her place. Ella stood, her movements slow and deliberate. If you ever change your mind, she said, there is a place for you here. Not as a maid, not as a servant, but as someone who's earned her place. As someone who has a right to call this home. Maria's heart stirred, but she said nothing. Instead, she simply nodded. Ella smiled one last time and walked out, leaving Maria alone with her thoughts. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of the house pressing in on her. She didn't feel the crushing expectations of others. She felt lighter, free from the shackles that had once defined her place here. Maria turned back to the window, her eyes watching as the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing barren out. She had come to this house as a stranger, and she would leave it no longer. The next morning, the house felt different. The quiet, heavy silence that had lingered for so long seemed to be lifted, if only slightly. There was a subtle shift in the way people moved through the halls, the way the staff whispered less and worked more. Maria had never thought much of the staff's interactions, but now, with her presence no longer merely tolerated, she noticed the small change. The glances were shorter, the murmurs softer. No one challenged her anymore. She had earned something that had been elusive for so long, a quiet respect. She stood at the window in the kitchen, watching the first light of the day break over the estate. Brian sat in his high chair, his little hands grasping at his spoon, trying to feed himself. The innocence of it all, the child, the early morning, the stillness of the house, brought a strange peace to Maria's heart. She had spent so many years in the struggle, both outward and inward, trying to carve out a place in a world that seemed indifferent to her. But now there was a sense of belonging, not in the way people expected her to, not as a woman who had found her place among the wealthy, but as someone who had fought for it, who had earned it in ways that couldn't be measured. Archer had kept his distance, but his presence in the house was now different. He spent more time with Brian, though he still hadn't fully confronted the weight of his actions. Maria could see the way he moved through the house, tense, restless, as if he was waiting for something. He wasn't the same man who had slammed his fist down and demanded explanations. That man had vanished behind a curtain of guilt, but Maria couldn't make him face that guilt. She couldn't force him to change. He would have to decide that for himself, in his own time. But she had a feeling he was getting closer to something, closer to facing what he had done. The day went by with the usual rhythm of the estate, the hum of the servants' chores and the occasional sound of Brian's laughter ringing out from the nursery. It was a quiet kind of chaos, the kind that came with the realization that everything had shifted, and that no one quite knew how to handle it. Later that evening, as Maria walked past the library, she caught a glimpse of Archer standing by the window, his back turned to her, looking out over the estate. His figure was dark against the light of the fading day, and for a moment Maria stood there, watching him. She knew the weight of what he carried. She knew that his guilt would never truly leave him, not unless he chose to release it. But she also knew that he had begun to understand the importance of his son, the importance of making things right, even if he wasn't sure how to do it yet. Maria felt a pang of something inside her, not sympathy, but understanding. She had her own battles to fight, her own ghosts to exorcise. But the difference between them, she realized, was that she had already started, she had already chosen to step forward. Archer, on the other hand, was still caught between the past and the future, unwilling to fully let go of what had shaped him. She had always known, deep down, that she couldn't carry his burden, he would have to face it himself. "Archer," she called softly, stepping into the room. He didn't turn at first, and for a moment the space between them stretched wide. She didn't know what she had hoped to say. She wasn't sure what they had left to say to each other. But then he spoke, his voice low and tinged with regret. "I don't know what to do anymore, Maria." Maria stood in the doorway, her hands folding in front of her. She knew exactly what he meant. "You don't have to do anything, not yet, but you will. When you're ready." He turned, his eyes shadowed with something that Maria couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe. Or fear. She couldn't tell. "I'm afraid it's too late. Too much has happened. Too much damage." Maria shook her head, stepping closer. "It's never too late. The damage is done, yes, but that doesn't mean it's the end. It just means you have to face it." Archer exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can." Maria looked at him, her gaze steady, but her heart racing. She wasn't offering him absolution. She wasn't offering forgiveness. She was offering something else entirely. The possibility of starting over, not with a clean slate, but with the understanding that everything had already happened. That, despite it all, there was still a way forward. "It's not about whether you think you can," she said softly. "It's about whether you choose to." He met her gaze, his face unreadable. "I don't deserve that. I don't deserve any of this." Maria stepped closer, her voice unwavering. "You don't have to deserve it. You just have to choose it." For him, she nodded toward Brian's room. "For your son." Archer didn't speak for a long time. He simply stared at her, as if weighing her words, as if he were finally seeing her for the first time. But Maria didn't wait for him to answer. She turned and walked toward the door, her hand resting on the knob. Before she stepped out of the room, she turned back to him. "I'm here," she said simply. "I'm not going anywhere, but you have to choose." And then, before he could say another word, Maria left him there, standing alone in the room, his back once again to the window. The next day, Maria found herself in the garden, lost in the tranquility of the moment, lost in the sounds of the wind in the trees and the scent of flowers drifting on the air. It felt like a new beginning, for Brian, for her, and perhaps even for Archer. The world outside was moving, shifting, and she could almost feel it, the rhythm of change beneath her feet. The past would never fully let go, but Maria had learned that it didn't need to. The future, however, was something else entirely. It was something that could still be shaped. As she stood in the garden, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks, she realized that the story she had feared was not the one that would define her. The story was still being written, and it was a story she was no longer afraid to live. The next few days unfolded in a strange kind of limbo, neither peaceful nor tumultuous, but suspended somewhere between the two. The house, once thick with tension, had started to soften though it was clear that no one could forget what had happened. The air was still full of that quiet, unsaid understanding, that the foundation of their lives had been irrevocably shaken. Yet, amid the fragile truce, something new began to bloom, like a flower pushing its way through cracked concrete. Archer was trying. Maria could see it, even though it was hard to admit to herself that there had been progress. She watched him during the day when he would take time to sit with Brian, watching him with an intensity that wasn't quite parental yet, but was beginning to move in that direction. He would cradle the boy in his arms, staring down at him with eyes that, for the first time in years, were no longer clouded with grief. There was still hesitation in his touch, still a kind of distance. But Maria couldn't help but notice the way his eyes softened when Brian would giggle or reach for him. He was trying, and for Maria that was all she needed to see. And yet, even as she watched the changes unfold, she knew that some things couldn't be forced. Archer would never be the man he once was before his wife's death, before his father's legacy had weighed so heavily on him. But there was a different version of him starting to emerge, a man who was learning to shed the shackles of grief and guilt, little by little. Maria, for all her patience, could feel the limits of her own endurance. She had been holding herself together for so long, trying to be everything for everyone, a caregiver, a protector, a mother figure. But she wasn't sure how long she could continue carrying this weight without something in her breaking. She had already given up so much, and the pieces she had kept for herself were becoming harder to hold on to. In the quiet hours of the evening, after the house had gone still and Brian was asleep in his crib, Maria found herself alone with her thoughts, standing by the large windows that overlooked the garden. The stars were beginning to appear, dots of light against a sky heavy with clouds. Her reflection was blurred in the glass, a woman caught between two worlds, 1 foot in the life she had left behind, and 1 foot in the life she was still trying to create. She had made her choice, but at what cost? She didn't regret it, not yet, anyway. But she was beginning to wonder what it would take to finally let go of the past, to stop holding on to the broken pieces that no longer fit. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see Archer standing there, hesitating at the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I wanted to talk," he said, his voice hesitant. Maria didn't say anything immediately. She just nodded, waiting for him to continue. He walked into the room, stopping a few feet away from her, as though unsure of the distance between them. "I know I haven't been the man you expected me to be," he began, his voice low. There was a tremor in it that Maria hadn't expected, a kind of vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "But I'm trying to be something different. I'm trying to be better. For Brian, for you." Maria's chest tightened at the mention of Brian. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the weight of the man he used to be, and the man he was trying to become. She could see the battle within him, the same kind of war she had fought within herself for years, the war between the man he was and the man he wanted to be. "I don't expect anything from you," Maria said softly, her voice steady, but her heart pounding. "But I need to know you're not doing this because of me. You need to do this for yourself." Archer stood still, his face unreadable, and for a moment it seemed like the room had frozen in time. Then, with a deep sigh, he nodded. I know it has to come from me. I don't know how to be better, but I'm going to figure it out. The honesty in his words, raw and unfiltered, struck Maria harder than she had anticipated. She had expected excuses, deflections, but what she got instead was the simple truth. It wasn't enough yet, not for her to fully trust him again, but it was a start. You're trying, Maria said, her voice softer now. That's all I can ask. But you'll have to do more than just try. You'll have to show me. Archer took a deep breath. And in that moment, Maria could see the weight of his guilt. The realization that he wasn't just trying to fix things, he was trying to fix himself. There was a moment of silence, a pregnant pause where neither of them spoke. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt oppressive, though. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding, the kind that was both a question and an answer. I'll show you, Archer said, his voice low but firm. I'll show you every day. Maria didn't respond. She didn't need to. The words weren't the important part anymore. It was what would happen next. It was the choices he would make from this point on that mattered. And for the first time in a long while, Maria felt something stir inside her, a flicker of hope. Archer stepped closer to the window, his eyes scanning the garden beyond. You've done something I didn't think was possible, he said quietly. You've made me want to be better. Not just for Brian, but for me. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I have a reason to fight. Maria stood beside him, her eyes drifting to the garden as well. It was peaceful, serene, the quiet hum of the estate settling around them. She could feel the weight of the moment, the way everything had shifted. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but in that moment they both knew something had changed. They both knew that it was only the beginning. Then fight, Maria said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. But fight for the right reasons. Archer didn't answer immediately, but the way he turned to her, the way his eyes softened, for just a moment, told her everything she needed to know. He was ready, and maybe, just maybe, she was too. The morning after their conversation, the house was bathed in an almost unnatural stillness. Maria stood in the kitchen, watching the first light of dawn stretch across the lawn. Casting long shadows. She was up early, as usual, but this time something had shifted in her. It wasn't just the quiet of the morning, nor the fact that the air felt a little warmer than it had in days. It was something deeper, something she could feel in the very bones of the house. Things were changing, even if it was hard to put into words. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand that change didn't always come with dramatic gestures or grand acts of redemption. Sometimes it arrived in the smallest of moments, like a man broken by grief finally beginning to understand the weight of his choices, or a woman, once an outsider, finally finding a place where she wasn't just tolerated but needed. She didn't know if she was ready to forgive Archer. Not completely. The scars left by his actions still ran deep, and forgiveness, if it came at all, would take time. But she could feel something in her heart soften, a crack in the wall she had built around herself. It was a crack that allowed light to filter through, a crack that allowed her to see the possibility of something more. Not just for Archer, not just for Brian, for herself as well. Brian was already awake, his small hands reaching out for her as she stepped into the nursery. His wide, curious eyes were fixed on her, and for a moment Maria forgot everything that had happened. It still loomed over her. In that moment there was just the child, her arms around him, the warmth of his small body against her chest. She rocked him gently, humming a lullaby under her breath. The world outside felt distant, as if the chaos of the past had momentarily been silenced. It was just her and the child moving together in the soft rhythm of the morning. Howler morning. And then the door creaked open. Maria didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She could feel Archer's presence in the doorway, the weight of his gaze on her. She could feel the hesitation in his every step, the same hesitation that had followed him throughout the past few days. But there was something different now. The tension in his shoulders was lessened, the hard lines of his face softened. He wasn't the man who had stormed through the door in anger. He was a man who had begun to understand the cost of his actions. "Good morning," Archer said, his voice tentative like he was testing the waters. Maria didn't look at him, but her response was softer than it had been before. "Morning?" He took a step forward, then another, until he was standing beside her, looking down at Brian, who was now giggling as he tugged at the hem of Maria's shirt. It was a sound that Maria had grown to love, the sound of peace, the sound of something untouched by the pain that had once dominated this house. "I'm sorry," Archer said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria glanced up at him, meeting his eyes for the first time that morning. There was a quiet sincerity in his gaze, an honesty that she hadn't seen before. "I know," she said, her voice steady but not unkind. "I know you are." Archer reached out a hand, almost hesitantly, but Maria didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed him to gently stroke Brian's head, a soft touch that spoke more than words could. "I don't know how to make up for what I've done," Archer continued, his eyes still fixed on the boy in Maria's arms. "But I'm trying. I will keep trying, every day." Maria didn't answer immediately. She simply watched him, watched the man who had once felt like an enemy, now standing beside her in quiet She wanted to say something, something that would make this moment feel final, something that would release the tension between them, but she couldn't find the words. And then Brian reached up, his tiny hand grasping at Archer's fingers. Archer looked down, startled, but Maria could see the flicker of something in his eyes. It was a recognition, perhaps, or maybe something deeper, a recognition of the connection between them, the child who had unknowingly brought them together. Archer let out a small, surprised laugh, and Maria couldn't help but smile. "He's reaching for you," Maria said, her voice soft. "Maybe that's the start." Archer nodded, his hand trembling slightly as he allowed Brian to grip his finger. "Maybe," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside the nursery faded away, and the only thing that mattered was the child in their midst, the promise of something new. "I don't deserve this," Archer said, his voice low, almost to himself. "You don't have to deserve it," Maria replied, her voice firm. "You just have to show up, every day." "That's enough." For the first time, Archer looked up at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I will. For him. For you." Maria didn't respond, but her heart swelled with something she hadn't expected, a kind of quiet hope, a quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, they could move forward. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but together. They stood there for a while, the three of them, in the soft light of the morning. Worlds began to stir. It wasn't a perfect moment, it wasn't a final resolution, but it was enough. Archer had a long way to go. Maria knew that. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but there was something in the way the boy smiled up at his father, something in the way Archer held him gently, that made her believe in the possibility of redemption. And maybe, just maybe, in the years to come they would find a way to heal. Maybe it was enough to start with this, with the willingness to try. And for the first time in a long time, Maria believed it was possible. Days bled into weeks, and time, in its quiet cruelty, began to carve new rhythms into the estate. The house, once an arena of brokenness and unspoken tension, began to breathe again, not with the loud, sharp breaths of anger or grief, but with a gentle, almost imperceptible rhythm, like the slow, steady turn of the seasons. The walls, so thick with silence before, now held the murmurs of reconciliation, the quiet hum of a family trying to rebuild itself. Archer had changed in ways that were small but undeniable. He no longer walked through the halls with the rigid posture of a man burdened by his past. There was a looseness in his movements now, a willingness to let go of the weight that had once pressed so heavily on his shoulders. He spent more time with Brian, his interactions no longer hesitant, no longer filled with the suspicion of a man who had never truly understood what it meant to be a father. The bond between them was still fragile, but it was there, growing stronger with every passing day. Maria watched it unfold with quiet patience. She had learned not to rush things, not to push for changes that could not yet be made. Archer would find his way, and when he did, it would be on his own terms. But for now, she was content to be there, to hold space for him, and for Brian, as they navigated the uncertain waters of their new reality. But despite the softening of the air between them, Maria knew that there were still things left unspoken. There were still the ghosts of the past that lingered, the dark corners of the house where the truth had been buried for so long. And though the light was beginning to filter through, there were moments when the shadows seemed to reach out again, threatening to pull them back into the past. Maria could feel it in the way the staff still moved around her, their gaze lingering just a little too long, their words clipped and guarded. Gloria had long since disappeared, but the ripple of her departure had left a mark on the house and on the people who remained. There were whispers sometimes when she passed through the halls, quiet murmurs that stopped as soon as they saw her. She didn't care, not really. She had long ago learned to ignore the subtle judgments of those who would never see her as anything more than an outsider. But even as she walked through the estate, carrying Brian in her arms, or sitting with Archer in the drawing room, she felt the weight of the house's history pressing against her. The truth that had been uncovered, the letters, the confessions, the pain, it was all still raw. It was all still real, and Maria knew that it wasn't over. They had cracked open the door to something that could not be easily shut again. The history of this house, of the Morgans, was a history steeped in silence, in shame, in secrets that had festered for far too long. And while some of the truths had been brought into the light, there were still more waiting, buried deep where only the bravest dared to look. But that was a fight for another day, Maria reminded herself. For now there was Brian, for now there was Archer, and for now there was the hope that this fragile peace could hold, that the small victories they had won could be enough to keep them moving forward. It was one afternoon, while she was walking through the garden, that the phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. For it was Ella, her voice steady but filled with something else, something unspoken. "Maria," she said, "you need to come to the study. It's about Archer." Maria's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she was paralyzed, unsure of what could be happening. She tried to steady herself as she made her way through the corridors, her mind racing with all the possibilities. But when she stepped into the study, she found not the chaos she had expected, but Archer standing by the desk, his back to her, his shoulders slumped with an exhaustion she hadn't seen before. Ella was sitting in the chair beside him, her face unreadable. The weight in the room was palpable, and Maria knew immediately that something had shifted, something that they had been avoiding for so long. Archer didn't turn when she entered, but his voice came low and tight. "I don't know how to fix this, Maria," he said. his words laced with the desperation of a man who had tried so hard, but still felt like he was losing the battle. Maria felt a chill spread through her chest, and she stepped closer to him, her voice calm but filled with concern. "What do you mean? What's happened?" Archer finally turned, and the look in his eyes caught her breath. There was something broken in him again, something that had resurfaced, like a wound reopened. "I thought I could change, Maria. I thought I could fix the past, be the father Brian needs me to be. But I can't. I can't outrun what I've done. I don't even know who I am anymore." Ella's gaze shifted to Maria, her eyes filled with a kind of sorrow, as though she had seen this, coming long before either of them had. Maria felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest, a deep, aching empathy for Archer. She stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not alone in this," she said softly. "You don't have to do it all by yourself." Archer looked at her, his face full of pain, but also something else, a flicker of understanding. "I don't know if I can ever be the man you need me to be," he said, his voice breaking. Maria's grip tightened on his arm, her heart aching for him. But she wasn't going to give up on him, not yet. "You don't have to be perfect, Archer. You just have to keep trying, keep showing up. That's all any of us can do." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them. The kind of silence that filled the room with the weight of all that had been said and all that remained unsaid. And in that silence, something shifted. Archer took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. "I'll try," he whispered. "For Brian." "For you," Maria nodded, her heart swelling with something close to hope. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. And in that moment, in the quiet of the study, Maria understood that the journey was far from over. There would be more moments like this, more struggles, more battles to fight, but they would fight them together. Not as perfect people, not as a perfect family, but as a family that had found its way back to each other. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The house, once filled with the shadows of secrets, now hummed with the quiet promise of healing. One step at a time, one choice at a time. For the first time, Maria felt the weight of the future lift just a little. Thank you for following this story on Shoe Stories. If this story moved you, taught you something, or made you reflect on the meaning of silence, please like, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below the video. Your voice matters. Let it be heard, whether it's in silence or loud. And don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos displayed on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity and unexpected heroes. We'll see you in the next story.